Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, when Diep's illness suddenly worsens, the hospital staff treat her condition with shocking indifference, leaving James torn between helplessness and rage. His love for her drives him to confront the doctors head-on, sparking an explosive argument that shakes the entire ward. As he fights against neglect and bureaucracy, James learns that love isn't only about staying by someone's side. It's also about standing up for them when no one else will. Stay with us until the end to see how his determination changes everything for Diep, and how even in a place filled with suffering, compassion and courage can still shine through. Don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The sterile hum of the hospital filled the air, each beep from the machines like a countdown echoing through James's chest. Morning sunlight filtered through thin white curtains, soft but cold, touching Diep's pale face. Her lips moved slightly, whispering his name, and James leaned closer, clutching her frail hand. "I'm here, Diep," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin was clammy, and though her breath came slow and uneven, her eyes flickered open, dim, searching for hope. I feel worse today," she breathed weakly. "Did the doctor come?" James hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He'd asked that same question hours ago. The doctor had glanced at her chart, muttered something about monitoring progress, then left, barely sparing a second look. "He'll be back soon," James lied softly, trying to steady his tone. But inside, frustration boiled. Every time he called for help, the nurses came with hollow smiles, routine words, and half-hearted gestures. No urgency, no care. It was as if Diep's life meant nothing to them. He rose from his chair, pacing near the end of the bed. "How long does it take for them to just check on you?" His voice trembled, not from fear, but anger contained too long. Diep reached for him, her trembling fingers brushing his wrist. "Please, don't make a scene," she whispered. "They're doing what they can." He turned sharply. "Doing what they can?" The words escaped louder than he intended, and a few heads turned outside the doorway. "They barely show up. You're burning with fever and they act like it's nothing." "James," she said softly, her tone frail but pleading. Her eyes, deep pools of exhaustion, still held one truth. She didn't want conflict. "Just stay with me." Her plea was a tether, pulling him back from the edge. He took a breath, forced his hands to stop shaking, and sat beside her again. "I'm sorry," he muttered. I can't stand watching you suffer while they ignore it." She smiled faintly, as if his anger was proof of love. "You care too much," she whispered. Moments later, the door creaked open. A young doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand, not even glancing up. "How's the patient feeling?" he asked flatly. James's blood ran hot. "You tell me. You're the doctor." The man blinked, startled. "We're monitoring her condition. Her vitals are stable. No need to panic." "No need to panic?" James snapped, his voice rising. "She's been coughing all night. Can't eat, can't even keep her eyes open. You call that stable?" The doctor frowned, his tone turning defensive. "Sir, please calm down. We're following protocol," She's responding slowly, but treatment takes time. Protocol? James barked out a bitter laugh. Is your protocol ignoring patients until it's too late? His words sliced through the sterile air, echoing down the hallway. The doctor stiffened. If you continue this behavior, I'll have to ask you to leave. Leave? James took a step forward, eyes blazing. You want me to leave my wife here so you can keep neglecting her? Do your job instead. James, stop! Diep gasped, her voice weak but desperate. The effort made her cough violently, and she clutched her chest. That broke him. He froze, guilt flooding through his anger. Diep, hey, breathe. It's okay. He held her, his voice trembling now. I'm sorry, love. I'm sorry. The doctor sighed, muttered something under his breath, and walked out, calling for a nurse. James didn't care anymore. He wiped Diep's tears, forcing a smile that barely held. I won't let them treat you like this, he whispered. You deserve better. For a while, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic drip of the IV and the hum of machines. Diep leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing shallow but even. You always fight for me, she murmured, even when I'm too weak to fight for myself. That's because I love you, he said softly, and I won't stop until you're safe. Outside the window, a bird perched on the railing, its wings glinting in the light. For a fleeting second, it felt like hope had returned. But James knew better. This fight was far from over. Later that afternoon, a nurse entered, checking the IV without a word. James watched her every move, his eyes sharp. She needs stronger medicine, he said. This drip isn't working. The nurse didn't answer, just scribbled notes. We'll inform the doctor. That's what you said yesterday, he shot back, and the day before that. She turned, visibly annoyed. Sir, you need to trust the process. Trust? James scoffed. I've been trusting you for days while she's wasting away. His voice cracked on the last words, raw from sleepless nights. The nurse sighed, setting the clipboard down. Sir, we're short-staffed. We're doing the best we can. He clenched his fists, wanting to scream, but Diep's soft voice interrupted. James, please. He turned. Her eyes were glistening, her lips trembling. Don't waste your strength on anger, she whispered. Just stay with me. He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. Okay. I'm here. He sat again, holding her hand tightly. Beneath the sheets, her skin was cool, her pulse faint. The world outside kept moving. Nurses walking by, announcements echoing. But for James, time stopped. Every second felt like a test of faith. He remembered when they first met, how she'd smiled at him through pain, refusing to ask for help even when she needed it most. That strength, that quiet fire, had drawn him in. And now, seeing her like this, small, trembling, fading, it tore him apart. Hours passed. The nurse returned briefly, adjusting the IV again. This time, James didn't speak. He just watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her. Silence reclaimed the room. Diep shifted slightly, her hand searching for his. Promise me something, she said, her voice barely audible. Anything. If I get worse, don't fight them. I don't want you in trouble because of me. James's heart clenched. Don't talk like that. You're not getting worse. She smiled faintly. You always say that." He met her gaze, fragile, yet filled with love, and for the first time in days, his anger gave way to fear. "I can't lose you, Diep. Not like this." A moment passed. Then her eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion winning over. James sat there, still holding her hand, whispering to no one, "I'll fix this. I swear, I'll fix this." Outside, the evening lights of the city flickered alive. The hospital corridor buzzed with life again. But in this room, there was only the sound of her breathing and the quiet fury building in his chest. He stood, determination hardening his face. If the doctors wouldn't help her, he'd find someone who would. He looked back at her one last time before stepping into the hallway, ready for war. James stormed down the narrow hallway, every step echoing against the cold, tiled floor. His fists were clenched, jaw tight, and his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Nurses turned to look, whispering quietly as he passed. He didn't care. He'd been patient long enough. When he reached the doctor's office, he didn't bother knocking. He shoved the door open. The middle-aged doctor inside barely looked up from his computer. "Mr. James, this is inappropriate." Inappropriate. James slammed his hand on the desk, voice trembling with fury. "What's inappropriate is you leaving my wife to die while you sit here pretending to work." The doctor sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Sir, calm down. I understand your frustration, but shouting won't help your wife." James leaned in, his voice low and sharp. "Then what will? Because all I've seen are excuses, not treatment." The doctor finally looked up, meeting his gaze with irritation. "We're giving her standard medication. Her recovery depends on her body's response. You can't expect miracles overnight." James scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't expect miracles. I expect effort. You barely check on her. Half the time it's the nurses doing guesswork. You call that treatment?" The doctor's expression hardened. "You're crossing the line. If you continue this behavior, we'll have to involve security." "Do it!" James shouted. "Maybe then someone will actually listen." The nurse at the door flinched, rushing off to call for help. James's voice cracked, pain leaking through his anger. "She's not just another patient to me. She's my life, and I won't stand here while you treat her like a number on a list." For a moment, the room went silent except for James's heavy breathing. Then, something in the doctor's face shifted, annoyance giving way to a flicker of guilt. "What exactly do you want us to do?" he asked quietly. "Run the full tests again," James demanded. "Check her infection, her lungs, everything. And this time, don't just glance at her chart and walk out. Look at her." The doctor hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine. I'll arrange it." James exhaled sharply, the fury in his chest still burning, but tempered by a small relief. "Thank you," he muttered, though the words tasted bitter. When he returned to the room, Diep was awake, her face pale, but eyes searching for him. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. He sat down beside her, brushing her hair from her face. "To make sure they finally do their job." She frowned. "You shouldn't yell at them." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were still stormy. "Sometimes yelling's the only way people listen." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I just don't want you to get in trouble because of me." "Trouble's worth it if it means you live," he whispered. She She squeezed his hand weakly, her lips trembling. "You always fight too hard for me." "I'll fight harder if I have to," he said firmly. Later that evening, 2 nurses entered with equipment, followed by the same doctor. They began running tests: blood pressure, oxygen levels, and scans. James stood back, arms crossed, watching every move. For once, they seemed serious. The doctor reviewed the scans silently, his brow furrowing. "Her lungs show signs of inflammation," he admitted. "We may have missed an infection earlier." James's eyes flashed. "You think?" The doctor ignored the remark. "We'll change her medication immediately. Stronger antibiotics. She should respond within 48 hours. As they left, Diep turned to James, her expression fragile but relieved. "So they finally found it?" "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "They should have found it days ago." Tears welled in her eyes. "Maybe now I'll get better." "You will," he said softly, holding her hand. "You have to." The following morning, sunlight streamed through the window, warm and golden. For the first time in weeks, Diep's color looked less ashen. She managed a few bites of breakfast, though her hands still trembled. James smiled, though exhaustion lingered under his eyes. "See, you're already improving." She looked at him, her gaze tender. "You didn't sleep, did you?" He laughed quietly. "I didn't want to miss any sign of you getting better." "James," she said softly, "you need rest too." He shook his head. "Later. Right now, I just want to see you smile again." Her lips curved faintly. "Then you're in luck." For a brief moment, they both laughed. A fragile sound, but it filled the room with life. But by afternoon, a wave of weakness struck her again. Her breathing grew shallow, her lips dry. Panic surged through James as he called for the nurse. The same doctor rushed in, adjusting her IV. "She's reacting to the new medication. It's normal," he said. "Normal?" James snapped. "She can barely breathe." "She needs oxygen. Move aside," the doctor ordered. James stepped back, fists trembling as the team worked. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen mask filled the air. He felt useless, watching the woman he loved fight for every breath. After what felt like hours, her breathing steadied. The doctor turned to him. "Crisis averted. Her body's just adjusting." James nodded numbly, unable to speak. He sat down, burying his face in his hands, tears escaping between his fingers. When he looked up, Diep's hand reached weakly toward him. "Hey," she whispered, her voice muffled under the mask. "Don't cry. I'm still here." He took her hand, pressing it to his chest. "You scared me," he said hoarsely. "Then don't shout at doctors anymore," she teased faintly, her humor still alive despite the pain. He laughed through the tears, shaking his head. "I'll try. No promises." That night, as the hospital lights dimmed, he sat by her bed, holding her hand in silence. The beeping of the monitor was steady now, like a heartbeat between them. "James," she murmured, eyes half closed. "If I survive this, I want us to leave the city, somewhere quiet, just us." He smiled, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "The countryside? Chickens, garden, the whole thing?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, somewhere peaceful. No hospitals, no noise, just peace." "You got it," he said softly. "Once you're out of here, I'll make it happen." The promise hung in the air, fragile but real. 2 days later, her fever broke. The doctor came in with a more genuine tone this time. "Good news," he said. "She's responding well to treatment. If this continues, she can go home soon." James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you, doctor," he said, and for once, he meant it. As the door closed, he turned to Diep, his voice trembling. "You hear that? You're going home." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Home," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "We made it," he whispered. "Because you never gave up," she said, smiling weakly. He laughed gently. "No, because we didn't." The golden evening light spilled across her face, soft and serene. For the first time in weeks, James felt something he hadn't dared to feel before: peace.